that brings us to the next speaker, sir, who in a way, I brought the next speaker together with you to also help us think about global migration governance. Now, this speaker, Ambassador Pietro Mona, he's somebody who has really, led the conversations at the global level in a number of contexts. And I think anything that I say will once again be doing him a disservice. But what I can say is this: Ambassador Pietro Mona is perhaps one of those people who has actually supported the conversations to be driven also from a Southern perspective. He has always tried to live true to what the government of Switzerland's perspectives are in building bridges between the North and the South, the East and the West. Pietro, if I may say, is a good friend, a former colleague. I've had the privilege of working with him. And he also led the Swiss delegation as the head of the Swiss delegation for the intergovernmental negotiations of the Global Compact for Migration. Pietro Mona, your microphone starts now.
Thank you very much, Shabri, and it's fantastic to be in this webinar with all of you. And again, the question, if you hear me and see me, because currently I can't see anyone and can't hear anyone. Okay, perfect. All right, good. Thank you very much. So this discussion, as it is framed, is about global and regional migration governance in times of COVID. But as my previous speakers did, and here I really salute Ambassador Shahidul Haq, who I find an absolute brilliant thinker on migration issues and on many other issues that I've had the privilege in exchanging thoughts with him. I think the ambassador already outlined quite well how COVID has impacted migration, how it will impact, how it will change the way that migration will be managed, governed, or not governed in the future, also because of COVID. Nonetheless, I think I dare to say that in many respects, I fully agree with his position. In many respects, however, when we look at the practical challenges, the vulnerabilities that migrant workers and migrants in general across the world are suffering now, I think many of the points we've actually, at one point or the other, have already touched upon in the myriads of discussions that we've had in the past, be it in the Global Forum on Migration Development, being in the UN, being during the negotiations of the Global Compact at the ILO, when we talk, for example, about fair and ethical recruitment procedures, or at the regional or at the national level. I think very much my position is in that sense that COVID has exacerbated, it has put a bright light on the vulnerabilities, but also on the weaknesses of our current system at all levels, at the local, national, regional, and global level. I think it has torn away, so to say, or it has opened our eyes on how a pandemic that is now turning into a macroeconomic crisis at the global level has impacted also the field of migration. And I think this is the first point that I would like to keep in mind, is that to many of the challenges that we're seeing now, to the questions of labor rights for migrant workers, to the questions of protective measures for domestic workers, on remittances, on return and reintegration, on mobility in general, I think in one way or the other, we have solutions, or we have ideas on how we can approach them. The question now is more, where is the political will? Where are the instruments? Where are the actors that can actually implement what we have thought of? Let's take the question of remittances. The ambassador has mentioned an initiative that we've launched together with the UK a couple of weeks back. It's a call to action highlighting concrete measures that governments, central banks, regulators, but also the private sector can take on remittances to ensure that the flow of remittances keeps going and that we try to reduce at least the negative impact COVID has had. The World Bank is talking about around $110 billion of remittances that are not going to developing countries because of COVID. $110 billion, that is about 2/3, 3/4 of the official development aid worldwide, just to give you a point of reference there. Now, when we come to the measures that we proposed, for example, using digital measures, for example, ensuring financial literacy, ensuring financial inclusion of migrants and their families, making sure that the transfer costs are being reduced. These are not new things. We have talked about them many, many times in various forums, including the G20, who has also had a plan of actions on reducing the transfer costs. So I think this underlines the fact that many of the solutions, many of the instruments are there, but it's a question of using them and implementing them. The second general point, and I will come then to the question of the governments, is very much also to understand, and I think this has also shown clearly in the last few months, how the issues of migration are interconnected with so many other topics. How migration, for example, the challenges that domestic workers are faced are so much interlinked with gender aspects in general. We've seen how labor migration issues are embedded in a much broader debate about the future of work, about labor rights, about the context in which labor should happen so that we have decent and appropriate workplaces for all persons. We've seen, and this is another initiative that Switzerland has taken, the impact COVID has had on education, also impacting many migrant children, in particular some undocumented migrant children, but also refugee children, displaced children, who were not able to go to school anymore. And education, schools for them is often a place where they can feel safe, where they can get an education, but also where they have interactions with their peers. I think this is where we see how what we do on migration has to be understood also in a broader context. And we have to continue finding inclusive solutions. We have to understand that any rhetoric that proposes us and them creates barriers. We have to understand that migrants are part of our societies. I've been migrant on several occasions when I worked in Nigeria, for example, when I worked in Armenia. I don't want to feel as segregated from a society. I want to be part of the society. And I think COVID has created a sense of coming together, of inclusiveness. And this is something that also looking forward on the governance issues, I think we have to nurture, we have to embrace that when it comes to migration, ideally we think in inclusiveness. We think about what measures can we take to strengthen a health system at the national level for everyone, including migrants. What can we do to work towards gender equality so that through that we can have a dialogue on the importance of protecting domestic migrant workers who by and large are women. We have to look at education, we have to look at our financial system, we have to look at all measures in a way that it profits both the host communities and the migrant communities so that we can move forward in a very inclusive and comprehensive way, as it is actually ingrained in the DNA of the 2030 Agenda. The 2030 Agenda is a masterpiece of multilateral negotiations, in my view, because it very much carries this image of us in a world with limited resources, one planet, one humanity. We have to find solutions together. And this entails very much also understanding migration as part of this. And how migration actually brings us together. In preparing this webinar, I just reminded of a concept that the ambassador Shahidul Haq used a lot during the chairmanship of Bangladesh of the GFMD. It's about connectivity. We talked, inspired by his critical thinking, we talked a lot about the importance of migration as an instrument to create connections, as connectivity. And I think this is very much in line with my thinking about connectivity and inclusiveness. I think this goes hand in hand. Now, what does this mean for the governance structure? I think for the governance structure, I'm quite skeptical if you really have to rethink everything. But I do appreciate the clarity of Nicola's presentation, also the critical points that she highlighted. But to an extent, it is also how can we best use the structures that we already have? And maybe then we can also come to the conclusion that some of them have to be adapted or expanded or new ones created. But what I think is important, and that ties back to, I hope, to the points that I made before, is that we look at the governance in the future. I think there are two elements that I will propose we should strive towards to be better apt in responding to the challenges of migration under COVID, but also the opportunities that migration in general has for sustainable development and the governments and the societies involved. This is firstly about a horizontal adaptation, so to say, expanding horizontally our governance structures. What do I mean by that? I think
Pietro, sorry, in about a minute and a half, if you could conclude. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Horizontally for me is making sure that all the partners are included at the table. I think in the GFMD, for example, we have come to a conclusion that it's quite useless to talk about labor migration without the private sector at the table. We are still working, I have to admit, on having a sensible and appropriate way to include the trade unions. But believe me, I'm very much in favor of making sure that the trade unions also have an appropriate representation in the GFMD. We have now started to learn how important it is to have local authorities at the table. We have for quite some time, but it has been an uphill battle, included civil society much more in our discussions as governments or between governments in the GFMD. So this is the horizontal expansion that we have to make sure that happens in the governance structure, bringing all the parties to the table. The vertical expansion that I see that should happen when it comes to governance of migration is to make sure that we understand on what we're doing on, for example, again, using the same example, domestic workers, how that ties to a broader gender policy or gender initiative. How what we are doing in ensuring access for migrants or refugees or displaced persons to health, how that ties towards a broader health debate. So we have to make these connections also vertically between migration issues and the overarching theme that we are addressing, because I believe that I think COVID has shown how all of these things are interconnected. Finally, and this is really my last point, and very briefly, I think we really have to embrace multilateralism. I think this is where the solutions have to be debated, have to be found. Those that are already on the table have to be taken and run with it together with our partners. But we do see a tendency in crisis that governments retreat back to national policies. They go back behind their borders. I think we have to do everything possible to push that back. Multilateralism is a key instrument to overcome. And I think this is where we then have to discuss, and this is what will come now, how we can actually interlink what we're discussing at the global level, guided by the 2030 agenda, together with the regional level, and then maybe also the national level. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Pietro. I think, you know, in so many ways, I'm going to one, thank you for the shout out that you have given to both the trade unions and the employers. I think it's important that we recognize the importance of the role that they play. And I'm glad that you will persevere to continue engaging with the Global Forum in a manner which also sees a good and inclusive incorporation of trade unions. I think it's very important to recognize that. I like what you said, 2030 agenda is a masterpiece of multilateral agenda. So please permit me to quote you on that line at some point in time when I intervene on the 2030 agenda. In fact, I always think that the 2030 agenda or the SDGs is on steroids. It's basically the MDG on steroids is what we've got for the SDGs. So it's important to recognize the fact that in 2000 the Millennium Development Goals had absolutely no reference to migration, and come 2015 we have migration peppered across the 2030 agenda. And I know that as well, Switzerland and Bangladesh as two governments led those conversations from the forefront. So embracing multilateralism is really key to this. Our Director General, the ILO Director General, Guy Ryder, also talks about the importance of multilateralism in such precarious times that we are in. Thank you very much, Pietro.